We're continuing with the Stories That Transform Lives series, related to this book, The Yes Effect. Luis Bush. Where can people buy this book, The Yes Effect? Well, Amazon.com has lots of books available to purchase. So now you know, you can find this book, The Yes Effect, at Amazon.com. These are stories of men and women that transformed lives, impacted and influenced the societies of the countries where they worked and lived. Today we're going to talk about the case of Norway, an amazing work done there, considered one of the most emblematic ones. Norway is considered, along with the other Scandinavian countries, a country that people look to for inspiration. It's first in the world in the ranking of human development. We should mention that human development ranking measures life expectancy of the citizens. It measures average years of schooling, the outcomes from that education, and also the income per capita in the country. And Norway holds first place. And this isn't something that was brought about by chance. And the story of this man, Hans Nielsen Hauge. I don't know how to pronounce it correctly in Norwegian. The story of this man is remarkable, and it starts around the 19th century, approximately. What is it that happens in a country so that it reaches this level of human development? Because human development isn't only about economic indicators or economic growth, but it also includes other aspects, such as religious freedom, humanitarian actions, which are also relevant issues in the development of a country. Norway's case is the example of transformation. It's the example of notable influence and how a country can prosper. Tell us a little about this man and what happened in Norway. Well, Hans Nielsen Hauge is a man who started working in the countryside with his family. And one day he was walking, doing his job, when a song came to his mind. It was a German song that talked about God, and he was deeply touched by it. He was 22 years old, and in that moment, he gave his life to Christ and started a new life. Norway was in crisis at that time. There was a lot of poverty. And also the landlords were abusing their power over people who rented their land. So they were facing several serious problems, and God raised up this man. And historians from Norway and other countries who have studied Norwegian history have, without exception, agreed that the cause for this country to be a model of transformation today is because of this man. It's the testimony of this man's life that marked a country up until today. It's a country that also has other characteristics, such as being a very pacifist country. In other words, it imitates a model of alliances with other countries that are absolutely anti-war, against social conflict. And that's also been a model for many countries. Not only a model, in fact, their work as peace agents in countries like Colombia was very instrumental. Meaning they were an instrument for peace talks in Colombia and its war with the FARC? Yes, that's right. And in many cases around the world, Norway is the country, because of its own internal experiences, that others look to Norway for its secrets. What are the things that they've done? What this nation has done as a country. Hans Nielsen comes from a lower-class family, but he ends up being a successful entrepreneur, which in the 21st century we would just call a businessman. How does a businessman develop a transformational model, looking beyond the cases that we've seen before, of people that are deeply connected to the spiritual world? So the model is interesting for all entrepreneurs, including businessmen with values, who wish to generate transformation in their surroundings and where they live. Yes, it was a country dependent upon livestock and a country lifestyle. And at one point, he's walking, and he receives this call from God. And that day, he wants to know what it means for his spiritual life, as well as his life as a man. So he starts off on this path, and his footsteps can still be seen today in the areas where he lived, as the areas that first developed in the country. He went about as an entrepreneur, founding enterprises. So when he would arrive at a place that had nothing but farms, and there was this need, he had a special gift that was, after meeting a group of people and spending only a few days with them, he could recognize the ones who had, in some way, a natural ability to be a leader or entrepreneur. He could identify that. So when he would leave there, going from one place to another, there are clearly marked locations in Norway of where he had been, but he would leave someone in charge to develop certain types of jobs. So there were industries, different types of industries and different jobs, and people in teams in charge and trained. And it was naturally born. It wasn't something like the business principles that we see today and have access to as a resource. But it was something more instinctive. It was something within him that I think God gave him that was able to identify and leave someone in charge. Why do historians recognize this man as the founder of all the transformation of what's known as modern Norway? Why? What relevant things did he do so that today people recognize him as an emblematic figure? What he did was to start businesses, and he had some principles that helped him. One of them was prayer. So as he walked along, he would also pray. And as he prayed the Lord's Prayer, when he prayed, "Thy kingdom come," he would think, how can God's kingdom come? So the next expression in that prayer is, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So the principle that he took to heart was, how can we see his will done on earth as it is in heaven? He started to reflect on that idea, and the principles that he drew from that process were the principles that he taught and left with the people he found and worked with in those locations. So the first concept that came to him was light. That's why they call his movement in Norway as the movement of light. Those who have studied his case in detail say that the tools that entrepreneurs had and put a hand to were the ones given by him to give tools of knowledge and principles of development in both industry and agricultural work, which were very different. The first people influenced by this newborn Hans were his sisters. What happened with them? Well, he shared with him, told them, "I was singing and felt God's presence, and I came to know him personally." So he testified to them, to his two sisters, and they believed and accepted Jesus Christ as Lord, and his family was greatly blessed. They started to live not only for themselves, but also for their neighbors, for others, and they began to testify. So today we can see where he went and trace his path, not only because there was industrial and work development in those places, but also a spiritual revival. Let's talk about a concept used nowadays in the world and in business. It's discussed quite a bit, but it's unclear how much it's put into practice, and that's ethics. It was one of the values, one of the concepts that Hans Nielsen developed. And it was fundamental also in how he developed the whole process or economic track of all that has to do with an economic development model. Right, ethics with regard to speaking the truth about love, the truth about work and working hard, and then, of course, the truth about developing as a community. So one of the characteristics of a transformed nation that's also included in the information about human development statistics is the degree to which people take part as entrepreneurs in the development of their part of the country or in other countries. And he was the one who stimulated that concept, that a community doesn't live for itself, but rather to develop and help others develop as well. Something that calls my attention is how he develops the ethics concept, especially in contemporary times, and I'm reading it here. He mentions 3 concepts. One is the vision that he had of humanity, and let me read it literally from the book. It says, "Do not demand too much, nor place too many burdens on your workers. No more than a fellow brother can be expected to bear." Expound a little on that for us. Yes, because we have to identify how much of a burden someone is carrying, right? With a family, you have the burden to put food on the table, and we can't overload those people because then they can't work in freedom. Right, so fundamentally it has to do mainly with work exploitation. It speaks of providing a fair and equal job for all employees, and not only those that are employers. That's the point he mentions there in that case. The second point he talks about is the vision he had for society, which has to do with, I underlined it because it says, "You should use and have the good things of the world to govern as good housekeepers." Talk to me about that concept of being a good housekeeper with our goods and properties. That nothing really belongs to us, so develop that idea a little more. Being a housekeeper or steward of what one has is to develop to the fullest extent the natural gift of the possessions that one has. So stewardship speaks of having resources, of having a family as part of the stewardship. And we have new generations, which are also part of that stewardship. And we also have fruit of the labor that begins to be something that we're going to be sure that's stewarded well. I don't know if that word exists, to steward. No, it would be to administrate. In other words, how to wisely manage the resources that we have. Everyone should help establish and manage factories and jobs according to their fortune and gifts, so idle hands may work. In other words, that which we do to make money can also create jobs and dignify others. It doesn't say it directly in the book, but I would imagine that includes fair salaries and good atmospheres and working conditions. So there he adds the concept of value. How do I administrate what I have? To produce personal wealth, or also to make an impact in my community by providing decent jobs. And that's not something that we necessarily see very often. In countries, not even in developed countries, that concept of, if I'm going to make money, if I'm going to create a business venture, then it should also benefit those who have collaborated in the process of making that money, providing decent jobs and good salaries. And what do you think about that? Because in Latin America, what usually happens is the complete opposite, many times. So there's so much inequality. And when we talk about the reason why, we see that wealth indicators show that the wealth is in the hands of only a few people. So giving this concept that Nielsen touches on here in this article is missing. That's right, and we can see in the life of the Norwegians that they've mastered the administration of the gifts that they have, the resources they have, so that there's a balance, even with women. That's also one of the determining factors in human development. It's a woman's place, and in Norway's case, women are very respected. They have a place right beside the men in the workplace and in other terms of equality. So that stewardship has several aspects for implementation. You visited Norway with Doris, right? Yes, many times. And you got to know a little about the story of Nielsen, not only his story, but also the country itself. And what was your impression? What's been your analysis on what they've achieved? Because it's a country that's really become a model in many ways, with the remarkable level of education, with income levels per capita that are unseen elsewhere, a peaceful country with other qualities and aspects like humanitarianism, that we don't see in other countries. It's a very generous country, considering many definitions of generosity, including spreading the teachings that Nielsen first learned and received from God, and then want to share that to the world. So there are more missions per capita in Norway than in any other countries in the world. And when they go as missionaries, they go with the concept that they've lived there. In other words, a holistic well-being, the development of the country, developing peace, where there are controversies and disputes in a community. So dealing with different cases. For example, cases such as India, where they left a mark between two ethnic groups that were enemies, the Antalis and the Maltos. One lived up higher and the other down in the south. They had many disputes, wars, heavy drinking, and many other serious situations. And the presence of missionaries that went out from Norway and arrived in that place in India helped these two tribes to reach peace in one moment between the two of them, because now they had the Word of God. They stopped over-drinking and started to respect each other and to communicate and create relationships. Another case, for example, in Guatemala. A missionary woman went to a city as an administrator of the city in Guatemala. And today, you can find testimony of her work and even a movie about that story and the impact of it, because they go to a community with a concept that's holistic, to a community or a family, and you can see the results of that when they go somewhere else in the world. That's why they've been called to try to mediate intense problems, struggles between countries, and wherever they go, they almost always seek to plant the fruit of what's happened in Norway. They send people to help in many ways throughout the world. What also strikes me is the development of what he understands as ethics, which is the third pillar, his vision of work. He says, our work and our willingness to serve should shine, to illuminate, and to be bright. Here he talks about the talents of people and their efforts at work should always be carried out with excellence, because excellence in doing the best work possible is eventually contagious and influences the ones around us. I'd like for you to give your insight about this concept, because in the end, when one sees the quality of jobs in Norway, the quality of their workers, the quality of professionals in Norway, they shine, no matter their level. So it's really interesting, because that's truly what makes their human development rate so significant. Very significant. So much so that other countries are looking to learn the concepts. And they now have an institute that's called Haugianism to teach his ideas and concepts to others. And also places where there's conflict, they send people. Several times we've had in Transform World people that have been sent from Norway, people who have studied Hans Nielsen Hauge's work, and they're able to share it. But also at a national level, to build countries, they already have a set model of principles, not only about all that is Norway, but also the principles that they've learned and investigated, and they've recognized them there. They know the key elements, the platform that's essential in some way for the development not only of a community, but also for a whole country. So they're sharing this everywhere they go, wherever they're invited, and especially in places they go that are very difficult. Let's talk about the church in Norway. It's mainly a Protestant country? Protestant, yes. The majority of the population is Protestant. Many Protestant people. And there's a development of missions that's given them a vision that's made them the country that's most involved in missions in the world. Although it isn't a country with a high population, the percentage of investment in the Protestant church missions is very high. It's higher than any other country in the world. It's surprising because it isn't a big country, but it sends the highest number of missionaries? No, per capita. Not the total amount of missionaries, but the amount per capita. They're sending more missionaries per capita and getting great results on the mission field also. What's also interesting in the article about Hans' life is that there's no record of him after his death. For someone so important to the history of Norway, the one responsible for the transformation of a country that places it now at the top of the human development indicators, as we talked about earlier. I think it's unbelievable, because we look at this man and one expects that, well, I'm going to look at him and what's to come is growth, but there's no record of him after his death, no testimony of this man that was so important in the transformation of his country. That's correct. We went to the place where he's buried. We stayed in that area with my wife, and we talked about it. Secular historians, who many aren't aware of the presence of the Word of God and the influence of God in the development of a country, they all recognize that the one who was really the motor behind the growth of all that Norway is today was Hans Nielsen Hauge. So he marked the way, and others have emerged, but they've taken more of his concepts to develop their own types of concepts that go beyond, just like what happened with this vision of light, to illuminate. So they've taken that model, and they all continue to this day. They just finished a series of films, like what we're doing here, for the country, that's always presented what one can use from Hauge's life. So up to this day, the man who's respected and the man to follow as a model after the Lord Jesus Christ for Christians is Hans Nielsen Hauge. What's also interesting for me from his life is that he isn't defined as a pastor or missionary. They define him as an entrepreneur that used Christian principles to transform and activate the economy, to activate education, and all that we've discussed. In his biography, there's no evidence in his life that could define him as a pastor or missionary. Let's say a more intense spiritual activity as one is used to seeing. But there's no reason to believe that he didn't effectively use his gifts, capacities, and his abilities as an entrepreneur to really use them with true effectiveness to produce an impact in his society. And I mention this point because not everyone is necessarily going to be a pastor. Not everyone is necessarily going to be a missionary. But there are obviously people that have Christian beliefs that use their abilities, their professions, and even their business expertise, not only looking to become rich, but also to contribute to their country, or city, or town. It's a very interesting story. What do you think about it? Because the previous stories have been about men that have led lives that were strongly and actively linked to the church. Hans was more a businessman that applied Christian principles in his society. Exactly, and he really paved the way. And now we have entrepreneurs around the world who are following his footsteps. Many of them have access to all the countries in the world, because there are some countries where you simply cannot enter under the name or title of a missionary, but they can enter as entrepreneurs. And he was one who was able to open doors to bridge the gap for a whole generation of entrepreneurs based on his own experience. And they're following his footsteps to help and collaborate in a very practical way in the development of a nation and even in a city. And this is the model that Hans left us. People who have small, medium, and large businesses might ask then, how can I do something more than just make money as a personal benefit, but rather in a benefit to society, something that contributes to society? What concept would you highlight from the life of Hans Nielsen Hauge? Something that people might apply and say, if you're hoping to have a small, medium, or large business, whatever your company is about, there are principles in the life of this man that were so relevant in the development of not only his personal life and economy, although I'm sure there was an impact, but also the development of the place where he lived and the country where he was born. What would you say? which concept in the life of this man, as a businessman, is the most important one from a point of view of Christian values or principles. I think the value is holistic, meaning that we all are life that has spirit, soul, and body. He is focusing on mankind as a person, holistically speaking, and a community that not only refers to the spiritual aspect, but also the development of all the aspects of life and community. He's marked the way and bridged the gaps to allow all of us to take that example and contribute in a practical sense to the development of communities and also ethnic groups in the world, just like he did. We've seen here the case of a businessman that truly revolutionized his country, and not only in the sense of being key to economic growth, but also a huge contribution to the human development, which is what has interested us here on Stories That Transform Lives.